I never expected a quiet afternoon with my grandson to reopen a chapter of my life I had carefully closed. What he noticed, and what he gently said, shifted something inside me that had been stiff for years. This is the memory of how a younger pair of eyes helped me finally look at my own past without flinching. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I've told parts of this story before, usually in fragments, usually with a shrug at the end as if it didn't matter anymore. But it did matter. It still does. And it began on an ordinary fall afternoon, the kind we get here when the air smells like dry leaves and somewhere is burning wood. I was 54 then, though my niece liked to remind me I felt older. My grandson, Caleb, had just turned 19 and was home from his first semester of community college. He had that in-between look about him, not a boy anymore, not fully settled into manhood either. He was taller than I remembered, quieter too, with a habit of watching people before speaking. He'd always been like that, even as a child, noticing small things others missed. He came over because his parents were out of town and I had promised pot roast, the kind that falls apart if you look at it wrong. We sat in my living room first, the late sun slanting through the blinds, dust floating like it had nowhere better to be. The house was the same one I'd lived in for over 20 years, full of familiar creaks, and the low hum of the refrigerator that never quite shut up. Caleb picked up a framed photo from the side table. It was old, edges soft, taken back when cameras didn't lie about wrinkles because there weren't any yet. It showed me in my early 20s, standing next to a man in a denim jacket. My smile in that picture always struck me as careful, like I was afraid of breaking it. "Who's this?" he asked, not prying, just curious. I felt my shoulders tighten before I could stop them. "Someone from a long time ago," I said, reaching for the frame but stopping halfway. I let him keep holding it. He nodded, studying it. "You look different," he said. "Different how?" "Like you're listening really hard. Like you're hoping he's going to say something important." That caught me off guard. I laughed, a short sound. "You're reading too much into it." "Maybe," he said, "but you're not smiling the way you do now." I didn't have an answer ready. That picture had been in that frame for years, and no one had ever described it that way. I'd always thought of it as a reminder of a time I survived, nothing more. We moved into the kitchen after that. I busied myself with carrots and potatoes, the steady rhythm of the knife helping me feel grounded. Caleb leaned against the counter, hands in his pockets, watching again. "You don't talk about before much," he said. "I talk about what matters," I replied. He considered that. Sometimes what we don't talk about matters too. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not a child asking questions, but a young man trying to understand the people who came before him. There was no judgment in his face, no demand, just patience. We ate at the small table by the window. Outside, a couple of kids rode bikes up and down the street, their laughter drifting in. Inside, the clink of forks and the steam from our plates filled the quiet. "I had to write this reflection for class," Caleb said between bites. "About family. About how the past shows up even when you don't invite it." I smiled. "Sounds heavy." "It was," he said, "but it made me realize something." I waited. "I think every generation leaves little echoes behind," he said. "Not on purpose, just by living. And the next generation hears them and tries to make sense of the sound." His words settled over me like a blanket I hadn't known I needed. I felt something loosen, just a bit, in my chest. After dinner, we moved back to the living room. The light had shifted, turning the walls a softer color. Caleb sat on the floor, back against the couch, while I took my usual chair. The photo was back on the table between us. "You don't have to tell me," he said, glancing at it, "but if you ever want to, I'd listen." That was it. No pushing. No expectations. Just an open door. I realized then how long I'd been guarding my own story, not because it was dangerous, but because I hadn't trusted myself to walk through it again. Sitting there with my grandson, hearing his steady voice, I felt something new. Not pressure. Permission. I took a breath, slow and careful, and placed my hand on the arm of the chair. The house felt warm around us, familiar and safe. For the first time in years, the past didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a path I might be ready to revisit, step by step, with someone who respected where it led. And that was how the healing began, not with a dramatic moment, but with a quiet evening, a shared meal, and a young man's thoughtful reflection that reminded me I was more than the hardest parts of my history. That night after Caleb left, the house felt different. Not lonely exactly, just attentive, like it was waiting to see what I would do with the quiet. I rinsed the dishes slowly, watching the water bead and run, replaying his words in my mind. Echoes. I dried my hands and stood there longer than necessary, staring at the small crack in the wall above the sink I'd meant to fix for years. I slept lightly. Dreams came in pieces, not sharp or frightening, just persistent. Faces I hadn't seen in decades drifted through, along with places that no longer existed the way I remembered them. When morning came, I made coffee and carried my mug to the back porch. The air was cool, and the sky had that pale gray look that promised sun later. I wrapped my sweater tighter and listened to the neighborhood wake up. Caleb came back the next afternoon. He said he'd forgotten a book, but we both knew that wasn't the whole reason. He didn't rush this time. He sat where he had before, and we talked about ordinary things at first. His classes, my neighbor's dog, the way the maple tree in my yard had started dropping leaves early this year. Eventually, he glanced at the photo again. "You don't have to go back far," he said gently. "Just where it makes sense to start." I thought about that. Where does a story like mine start? With love? With disappointment? With the quiet decisions you don't realize are decisions until much later? "I was about your age," I said finally. "Maybe a little older. I thought I knew who I was." Caleb nodded, encouraging but silent. I told him about the small town I grew up in, the one with one main road and a diner that served the same pie every day of the week. I told him how leaving felt like freedom and how freedom sometimes disguises itself as certainty. I talked about meeting that man in the photo, how he spoke with confidence and made plans easily, as if the future were a thing you could simply schedule. Caleb listened without interrupting. His face didn't change much, but his eyes stayed on me, steady and kind. "I thought being chosen meant being valued," I said. Saying it out loud made my throat tighten. I didn't know yet that those aren't always the same thing. The room felt still, as if even the clock had slowed. I wasn't telling him everything, not yet, but I was telling the truth. That felt new. "You didn't fail," Caleb said after a moment. "You learned." I shook my head. It didn't feel like learning at the time. "It rarely does," he replied. We took a break then. I made tea, and he helped without being asked, rinsing cups, lining them up neatly. Watching him move around my kitchen, so comfortable and respectful, I felt a surprising swell of gratitude. Not just for him, but for the years that had passed, for the distance that allowed me to see myself with softer eyes. Later, we went for a walk. The street was lined with trees in various stages of letting go. Leaves crunched under our feet, and the sun filtered through branches, warm, but not overpowering. We walked side by side, not needing to fill every moment with words. "You know," Caleb said, "when we did that assignment, I realized something about Grandma." I smiled. "What's that?" "You're not just who you are now. You're also all the versions of you that got here." I stopped walking. He did too, turning to face me. "I like this version," he added quickly. "But I think it took strength to become her." I felt my eyes sting, and I didn't rush to hide it. Standing there on the sidewalk, with the sound of distant traffic and the smell of fallen leaves, I let myself feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. That evening, after he left again, I took the photo out of its frame. I held it in my hands, really looked at it. I noticed things I hadn't before. The tension in my shoulders. The way my eyes searched the face beside me. I didn't judge her. I felt compassion. I placed the photo back, but not exactly where it had been. I moved it closer to the bookshelf, among the novels and old journals I'd kept from various stages of my life. It belonged there, I realized. Not hidden away, not front and center either. Just part of the story. As the days went on, Caleb and I talked more. Sometimes about the past, sometimes about his future. Each conversation felt like another small stitch, closing a wound I'd grown used to ignoring. I wasn't rewriting history. I was finally reading it with care. And in doing so, I began to understand that healing doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from being heard, from sharing space with someone who honors your experience without trying to fix it. That understanding settled into me quietly, like something I'd been waiting for without knowing its name. The weeks that followed slipped into a rhythm I hadn't felt in a long time. Not busy, not empty, just steady. Caleb started coming by every Sunday afternoon. Sometimes we cooked, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes we talked about big things, sometimes we sat quietly, each of us doing our own small task, comfortable in the shared space. One Sunday, rain kept us indoors. It tapped against the windows in a way that made the house feel even more enclosed, like the world had narrowed to just the two of us and the familiar rooms. I pulled out an old box from the hall closet, one I hadn't opened in years. It was heavier than I expected. The cardboard softened at the corners. "What's in there?" Caleb asked. "Pieces," I said, "of different times." He helped me carry it to the living room. We sat on the floor this time, the box between us like a quiet invitation. When I lifted the lid, the smell of old paper rose up, unmistakable and oddly comforting. There were letters, some folded carefully, others creased and worn. A few notebooks. Ticket stubs. A scarf I'd forgotten I owned. Each item felt like a small pulse of memory. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," Caleb said. "We can stop any time." "I know," I replied, and I meant it. That trust, that understanding, made it possible to keep going. I picked up one of the notebooks. The cover was faded blue, the edges frayed. "I used to write when I didn't know how to speak," I said. "I thought if I wrote enough, I'd eventually understand myself." "Did it work?" he asked. I smiled. "Sometimes." I read him a short passage. Nothing dramatic. Just a younger version of me describing a feeling she couldn't name, a sense of standing at a crossroads without a map. My voice shook at first, then steadied. Caleb listened, leaning forward slightly, as if the words themselves might drift away if he didn't stay close. "You were honest," he said when I finished, "even when you were confused." I didn't feel brave, I admitted. I felt lost. "Those aren't opposites," he said. that landed deeper than he probably realized. We spent the afternoon going through the box, not in order, not with any plan. Some things I explained, others I didn't. He never pushed. Every so often, he'd ask a simple question that opened a door I hadn't known was still there. At one point, I held up a letter and laughed softly. I remember thinking this was the end of everything. "What happened instead?" he asked. "Life," I said, slowly, in ways I didn't expect. Outside, the rain eased into a drizzle. The light shifted, and the room took on that late-day glow that makes everything feel temporary and precious at the same time. Later, we made soup, the kind that simmers gently, filling the house with warmth. As we chopped vegetables side by side, I felt something else stirring beneath the memories. Not sadness, not regret, something closer to relief. "You know," I said, "for a long time I thought moving on meant forgetting." Caleb glanced up from the cutting board. And now I think it means remembering without pain," I said, "or at least without fear." He nodded, as if filing that away. That night, after he left, I sat alone again, but the quiet no longer pressed in on me. I opened one of the notebooks and began to write. Not about the past exactly, but about the space between then and now. About the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming again. The next Sunday, Caleb brought something of his own. A short essay he'd written for class. He hesitated before handing it to me. "You don't have to read it," he said. "I just thought you might want to." I took it carefully, aware of the trust in the gesture. As I read, I saw myself reflected not as a burden or a mystery, but as a presence that had shaped him quietly, steadily. He wrote about resilience, about how strength doesn't always announce itself, about learning from someone who kept going even when the path wasn't clear. When I finished, I looked up at him. "Thank you," I said. "It didn't feel like enough, but it was what I had." He shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I learned it from watching you." That stayed with me long after he went home. I began to notice changes in myself. Small ones at first. I slept better. I caught myself humming while I cleaned. I answered the phone without bracing for bad news. The past hadn't changed, but my relationship to it had. It no longer stood between me and the present. One afternoon, I walked past the mirror in the hallway and stopped. I looked at my face, really looked. The lines were still there. The years showed, but there was something else too. Ease, a softness I hadn't allowed myself before. I realized then that healing hadn't come from revisiting every hurt or rewriting every memory. It had come from connection, from being seen by someone who didn't carry the weight of those old moments, who could reflect them back without distortion. Caleb hadn't fixed anything. He hadn't needed to. He had simply listened, and in doing so, he had given me the space to listen to myself. As autumn edged closer to winter, I felt ready for the next part of the story. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer afraid of what might surface. The past had softened its grip, and in its place was something steadier. Understanding. And that, I was learning, was its own kind of peace. By the time winter settled in, the kind that quiets everything, even the roads, I noticed how much lighter my days felt. Not in a loud, celebratory way, but in the way a room feels after you open a window that's been stuck for years. The air changes. You breathe differently without even thinking about it. Caleb kept coming by, though less often once his classes picked up again. When he did, our conversations weren't always about the past anymore. Sometimes we talked about where he might transfer next year, or the job he was thinking of applying for. Sometimes we watched old movies, the kind where the dialogue moves slower and the silences mean something. We didn't need a reason to be together. That, I realized, was part of the gift. One afternoon, not long before the holidays, he asked if I wanted to visit the old part of town with him. There was a small park there I hadn't been to in years, tucked behind a row of buildings that had changed hands more times than I could count. I used to take walks there, I said, surprised he even knew about it. I know, he replied. You mentioned it once. I thought maybe we could go together. The park was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just bigger now, fuller with years and perspective. The benches were cold, the trees bare, their branches etched against the sky. We walked slowly, our breath visible in the air. I stopped near a bench that faced a narrow path. I sat here once, I said, more to myself than to him. A long time ago. I was trying to decide whether to stay or leave. What did you decide? He asked. I left, I said, and for years I wondered if that meant I'd failed something, or someone. Caleb didn't answer right away. He sat down on the bench, patting the spot beside him. I joined him, the woods solid beneath us. Maybe leaving was how you stayed true to yourself, he said finally. I looked at him, really looked, at the young man who carried his thoughts carefully, who understood that life wasn't made of clean lines or simple choices. Maybe, I said, and for the first time that answer felt complete. We sat there for a while, watching a couple walk their dog, listening to the distant sound of traffic. I felt no urge to rush away, no pull